Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into a bizarre case involving a young mother found in her home under suspicious circumstances. From the very first hours of the investigation, the police uncovered several disturbing and chilling clues. Detectives were faced with a series of unexpected twists, but ultimately managed to solve the case. Kathy Martin, born on October 2nd, 1959, in Houston, Texas, grew up in a loving family and was very close to her older sister. While in high school, Kathy met a guy named Mike, and a few years later, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Houston, and shortly after their wedding, they had a daughter. 3 years later, Kathy became pregnant again, and by early 1987, she gave birth to a son at the age of 27. After the birth of their second child, Kathy stayed home full-time to care for the kids. Mike worked at a small sign-making factory owned by Kathy's father, and the family was financially stable enough to raise their children. Kathy's parents also provided financial support, allowing her to focus entirely on caring for the family. On March 3rd, 1987, as usual, Kathy stayed home with the kids while Mike went to work. After his shift, Mike decided to meet some friends at a bar. He called Kathy from a payphone but got no response, which was very unusual because Kathy rarely left the house. Concerned, Mike called back several times but still received no answer. He contacted their neighbor, Tim, asking him to check on Kathy. Tim went to Kathy's house and knocked on the door, but no one answered. Looking through the living room window, he saw the TV was still on, so he continued knocking but got no response. Growing more worried, instead of going back to call the police or Mike, Tim got into his car and drove around town to find a patrol car. After a few minutes, he found a police car and explained the situation, asking them to check on Kathy's house. When the police arrived, they also got no response from inside. Trying the door handle, they found the door unlocked. Once inside, the police immediately discovered Kathy's eldest daughter unconscious on the living room sofa. She had severe injuries but was still alive. The police quickly called an ambulance and continued to check other rooms. In the bedroom, they found the younger child safely and healthily in the crib, but in another room, they witnessed a horrific scene. Kathy was lying on the floor, her body covered in blood, naked, and deceased. Her hands were tied with the cord of a lamp. Medical staff took Kathy's daughter to the hospital, while investigators began examining the crime scene. Kathy's father arrived shortly afterward, but the police did not disclose all the details of the incident. Instead, they asked him to go to the hospital to be with his granddaughter when she woke up. He complied and only learned of Kathy's death through a news report on TV while waiting at the hospital. Meanwhile, Mike returned home, and the police immediately noticed something unusual. Besides being late, Mike's shirt had some stains that looked like blood. The police asked him to hand over his clothes and answer questions. At the same time, investigators made several important discoveries. First, they found bloodstains in the bathroom, suggesting that the attacker had tried to clean up the scene, indicating that the assailant had stayed in the house for some time instead of leaving immediately after the crime. Second, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry. All windows and doors, except the front door, were locked. This indicated that Kathy either opened the door for the attacker or that the attacker had a key. Another detail that caught the police's attention was that all of Kathy's clothes were neatly folded on the floor next to her body. This not only suggested the possibility of a sexual assault, but also seemed strange, as the attacker had carefully folded her clothes. The detective speculated that the assailant might have threatened to harm Kathy's children if she screamed or resisted, forcing her to comply before being killed. Meanwhile, the medical team was fighting to save Kathy's daughter. They determined that she had been severely beaten, likely with bare hands. After several hours in the hospital, she slipped into a coma, and her chances of survival were very low. Medical experts examined Kathy's body and found 16 stab wounds, mostly in the abdominal area. They also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and collected biological samples from the attacker. However, at that time, DNA analysis was not widespread. so the experts were unable to extract a DNA profile from the scene. The best they could do was determine the attacker's blood type, and the biological sample was sent to the lab. From the early hours of the investigation, the police began to focus on Kathy's husband, Mike. The suspicious stains on his shirt led the police to seize his clothing for testing. Mike's behavior also attracted attention. After finishing work, he went out with friends. But instead of going home when he couldn't reach Kathy, he asked a neighbor to check on her. Detectives had seen similar cases where a husband committed the crime, created an alibi by going out, and then had someone else discover the body to avoid suspicion. Investigators began to look into whether Mike had enough time to commit the crime before meeting his friends. They quickly uncovered another clue. Mike had a criminal record from his high school days. Soon after graduating, he was arrested for selling drugs to an undercover cop. Mike was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but only served 2 years before being released on parole. A while later, he married Kathy. However, the police still needed more evidence to charge Mike. They also began investigating Kathy's neighbor, Tim, who had acted strangely. Instead of calling the police from home, he drove around town to find a patrol car. The detectives checked Tim's car and found another suspicious clue: blood-like stains on the carpet. The sample was sent to the lab for analysis. Investigators began to suspect whether Mike and Tim could have collaborated in the crime, or if one of them acted independently. Meanwhile, medical experts completed the forensic report with an important conclusion. Kathy died around 1 p.m., about 6 hours before her body was discovered. This forced detectives to figure out where the suspects were and what they were doing that afternoon. Mike and Tim both claimed that they were at work when the murder occurred, so the police began verifying their statements. 2 days after the crime, they received a call from the hospital. Kathy's daughter suddenly woke up from her coma. Her life was no longer in danger, and the investigators quickly went to meet her, hoping to find a clue. However, they faced difficulties as she was only 4 years old at the time and had nearly no memory of that day. The only thing she remembered was that a man with light-colored hair had entered the house. Both Mike and Tim had black hair, but the detectives did not immediately rule them out as suspects, thinking that the child's memory might be inaccurate due to the psychological trauma. They consulted a psychologist to help the child recover her memories. Not long after, the detective received a call from the lab and discovered an unexpected twist. Experts examined the evidence from the 2 suspects and determined that the stain on the neighbor's car carpet was merely engine oil, while the stain on Mike's shirt was paint. Additionally, several of Mike and Tim's colleagues confirmed that both were at work all day and didn't leave until evening. This indicated that neither had the opportunity to go to Kathy's house and commit the crime. The detectives asked both men to take a polygraph test, and the results showed no signs of deception. With the initial suspicions cleared, the police were almost back to square one. They redirected their focus toward other suspects familiar with Kathy who could have entered her home without difficulty. When speaking to Kathy's family and friends, the detectives asked if they suspected anyone. Many people, without hesitation, named Greg, Kathy's brother-in-law. They revealed that Kathy often complained about Greg's behavior. According to Kathy, Greg frequently flirted with her openly and made multiple attempts to persuade her into an intimate relationship. He also made inappropriate comments about Kathy's body, particularly her abdomen, where most of the stab wounds were concentrated. The police also learned that Greg was a regular user of illegal substances and had a criminal record. The detectives quickly focused their investigation on him and uncovered the first clue. Forensic experts found fingerprints in Kathy's house that matched Greg's, as well as a hair sample consistent with his. However, since Greg often visited Kathy and Mike's home, the fingerprints and hair could have been left during a prior visit and not during the crime. Kathy's parents were convinced Greg was the murderer. Her mother even shared a key observation. While she was at the hospital with her granddaughter, Greg came to visit them late at night. As soon as the little girl saw him, she turned to her grandmother with a frightened expression. After Greg left, the grandmother asked the girl if he was the man who had been at their house, but the girl said she still couldn't remember clearly. Upon hearing this, the detectives summoned Greg for questioning. Greg denied any involvement and claimed he was with a friend at the time, a friend who also had a lengthy criminal record. During the interrogation, Greg excused himself to pay for more parking time but never returned to the station. Kathy's sister stated that Greg had dropped her off at work around 10:30 a.m. that day and picked her up at 2:30 p.m., leaving a 4-hour window that matched the estimated time of Kathy's murder, giving him an opportunity to commit the crime. However, the police still lacked concrete evidence to charge Greg. As a last resort, they decided to analyze biological samples from the victim's body. At the time, technology only allowed identification of the perpetrator's blood type, and such an analysis would nearly deplete the sample, making further tests difficult. The police proceeded with the test and determined that the blood type matched Greg's. However, this evidence was insufficient to prove his guilt, and the detectives couldn't arrest him. The police continued to search for evidence, but failed to directly link Greg to the crime. Eventually, the case went cold. Kathy's family believed Greg was the killer but couldn't do anything more. Shelley, Kathy's sister, refused to believe her husband was guilty and continued living with him. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, the detectives requested DNA analysis of the remaining biological sample. However, the technology at the time only allowed partial DNA profiles. The results compared to Greg's DNA were inconclusive. The analysis showed that Greg belonged to the 2% of the population who could match the partial DNA profile, so the police couldn't arrest him based on these findings. The detectives called Greg in for questioning again and informed him that the DNA results from the victim's body matched his. Surprisingly, Greg changed his initial statement, claiming he had a consensual relationship with Kathy and had visited her on the day of the murder. However, he insisted that Kathy was alive when he left. Greg's sudden change in his story raised suspicion among the detectives, as this often happens when suspects are confronted with DNA results. Furthermore, Kathy had complained that Greg made her uncomfortable, making the possibility of a secret relationship unlikely. Despite their suspicions, the detectives knew they couldn't convict Greg without a full DNA match. Local prosecutors confirmed that securing a guilty verdict was nearly impossible, and the case stalled again for several years. In 2002, the detectives reopened the case and contacted forensic scientist Catherine Long, who was conducting groundbreaking DNA research. Catherine and her team experimented to see if they could extract genetic material from a perpetrator's hands left on a victim's body after strangulation. They simulated strangulation by gripping each other's necks, then collected samples from their hands and necks. The results were remarkable. Even brief contact left enough skin particles for DNA analysis. The detectives in Kathy's case were intrigued by the experiment, even though Kathy had not been strangled, and re-examining her body after so many years was impossible. Instead, they reviewed all the evidence to find items the perpetrator might have touched. Their attention quickly turned to the string of lights used to tie Kathy's hands. Only the perpetrator could have tied the string. As the victim couldn't have done it herself, the detectives sent the string to Catherine for testing. Catherine and her team examined the string, noting that it had been preserved in a paper bag, allowing airflow and preventing moisture buildup that could damage biological samples. The experts collected samples from the entire length of the string, including areas stained with Kathy's blood. After analysis, they found 2 DNA profiles. The first belonged to Kathy, which was expected, but the second profile matched Greg's DNA perfectly. This provided strong evidence proving Greg had tied Kathy's hands, and thus, he was the killer. 15 years after the murder, Greg was arrested. During interrogation, he denied his guilt and insisted that he had a consensual relationship with Kathy. Unconvinced, the detectives decided to bring the case to trial with the DNA evidence. While awaiting trial, Greg remained in custody. Shortly after, the detectives received a call from Greg's cellmate, who claimed Greg had confessed everything. According to the cellmate, Greg boasted about assaulting and killing his sister-in-law in detail. He said that on the day of the crime, he used drugs and went to Kathy's house. There, he tried to force her into an intimate relationship, but Kathy resisted and demanded he leave. When rejected, Greg turned his aggression on Kathy's daughter, beating the little girl severely. Greg threatened Kathy, saying he would kill her son if she didn't comply. Left with no choice, Kathy agreed to protect her children. Greg tied her hands, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her multiple times, killing her. He then washed the blood off in the bathroom and changed into her husband's clothes to avoid getting blood in his car. The detectives believed the cellmate's testimony because he couldn't have known such precise details from reading the news. Confronted with this, Greg finally confessed to the crime. He repeated everything he had told his cellmate. In 2004, Greg pleaded guilty before a judge and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. However, he served only 4 years before dying of liver cancer at 56. Kathy's husband, Mike, didn't live to see the day her killer was caught, as he passed away at 45. Kathy's children and parents expressed their gratitude to the detectives for solving the case, even though it took 15 years. During that time, they had been certain Greg was the culprit but felt powerless as they watched him live with Kathy's sister without facing justice.